This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Long before the January 6th insurrection, far-right extremist groups had been gathering members to take back their country from what they saw as dark forces plotting against them, like the government with its COVID lockdowns and protesters who demanded racial justice and police accountability. In 2020, longtime journalist Luke Mogelson started reporting on this growing discord, talking with groups like the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, and Patriot Militias, and he was there on the day the U.S. Capitol was attacked. In his new book, The Storm is Here, Mogelson traces the evolution of extremism and the factors that ignited the far-right movement, including the many conspiracy theories and a now former president who spoke directly to these extremist groups. Mogelson joins us where we live. Coming up, we also talk about a new Anti-Defamation League report that uncovers who's listed as members of one extremist group. Hearst, Connecticut reports 476 state residents were among 38,000 people nationwide who were listed on the Oath Keepers membership database. We hear from the Anti-Defamation League. That's later. First, joining us on Zoom is Luke Mogelson, author of The Storm is Here, An American Crucible. I mentioned he's a longtime correspondent, has worked for The New Yorker, and has covered the wars in Iraq and in Syria, the Ebola epidemic, and social unrest in the U.S. Luke, welcome to our show.
Thanks for having me.
There is an excerpt of Luke Mogelson's new book, The Storm is Here, on our website, ctpublic.org/where we live. So, Luke, how do you begin to cover militia groups in the United States?
Well, you basically just show up at their publicly held events. I was living in France at the beginning of the pandemic when I started to see reports, footage, and images of some of these groups mobilizing against the early COVID-19 public health measures, especially in states like Michigan. So I just flew to Michigan and started attending their rallies and speaking with them.
So when you were living abroad, before you took this assignment, did you recognize the country that you were seeing, these protests and a lot of this discord that was growing?
Not really. I mean, some of these images were pretty striking to me. I hadn't lived in the U.S. for about 10 years. I'd been covering the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. So to see Americans wearing flak jackets and carrying semi-automatic rifles and occupying state houses, accosting lawmakers, was a kind of perturbing echo of some of the things I had seen in foreign conflict zones.
Mm. That's interesting when you think about your transition from reporting in conflict zones, whether Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, thinking about the grievances of the people on the ground there, and then contrasting it with what these extremist groups were upset about. Can you talk about that?
Sure. I mean, in almost every civil war that I've covered, the participants, the combatants, and the men willing to kill and be killed for their cause genuinely have real grievances and injuries that they either want to avenge or remedy. And a lot of them even have the scars to prove it, or have lost family members, or have lost their villages or homes, or have been imprisoned by dictatorial governments. In contrast, the far right in the U.S. is almost entirely galvanized and animated by fictional villains and antagonists who have been fabricated whole cloth by purveyors of conspiracy theories and politicians who promote nativist ideologies.
Mm. Before I ask you about what it was like to go to these events by these Michigan militias, I'm wondering if you can define for us when we talk about far right extremist groups in the U.S. Are they all white supremacists? Are they all anti-government? Talk through when we see the overlaps here, and what are some of the other causes that bring them to these organizations?
Well, they're certainly all anti-government by any reasonable description of that term. I wouldn't classify them all as white supremacists. I mean, you can even find Black Proud Boys, for example. But the general mobilization that they are a part of is certainly energized and led by people who are white supremacists, anti-Semites, and also who subscribe to ideologies that are pretty clearly anti-immigrant, anti-LGBTQ, anti-Semitic, etc. So whether or not those certain individuals aren't quote unquote white supremacists, the movement that they're part of leans heavily on those ideas.
So take us to Michigan in 2020 when you went to these events, and it seemed like COVID restrictions at the time was really propelling them forward in their movement. Tell us what you saw and heard.
Yeah, I think that for a lot of the Michiganders who were part of the anti-lockdown movement, which was one of the first in the country, and which kind of set the tone for other states and the national mobilization against public health policies related to COVID-19. For them, what they were seeing was just kind of validation or confirmation of deep-seated paranoias about government overreach that they had before the pandemic, and that ran the gamut from outlandish conspiracy theories about the deep state and the New World Order to just more kind of traditional conservative leeriness of federal and state interference in individual liberties, like gun control, for example.
And we remember the plan for some militia members to kidnap Michigan Governor Whitmer. And so when you're talking with them about, what these militia members, what brought them, to these events, why they were standing against the government, I'm just wondering if you can talk more about what that was like and how they approached you as a journalist.
Yeah, well, it evolved. So, I actually spent a bit of time with and spoke with some of the guys who were accused of being involved in that plot, Adam Fox and William Knoll and his twin brother. The Knowles were part of the Michigan Liberty Militia, which was partly responsible for that first rally on April 30th, where they entered the State House with weapons. And I subsequently attended other rallies, including one in Grand Rapids, Michigan, just a couple weeks later, where the Knowles actually shared a stage with the Michigan State Senate leader, a Republican named Mike Shirkey. And Shirkey, who after the initial April 30th rally had condemned and disavowed the protesters that entered the Capitol, calling them a bunch of jackasses, he then went on to stand on this stage in Grand Rapids with them, praise them, and tell them that they needed to stand up to this government and that, quote, "we need you now more than ever." So, from the very beginning, there was an explicit endorsement by the Republican establishment of these groups and of their use of violence and the threat of violence to achieve political aims. I also was at a rally on June 18th, once again at the state capitol in Lansing, where Adam Fox, one of the leaders of the Wolverine Watchmen militia that ended up being accused of plotting to kidnap the governor, had a very heated standoff with an exchange with Black counter protesters, and this was in the wake of George Floyd's death. So that was interesting to see as well, because prior to Floyd's murder, most of these groups had been very explicitly anti-law enforcement and had decried and castigated officers for enforcing some of these COVID-19 policies. After Floyd was killed, they shifted to backing the blue. And I saw that at that June 18th rally with Adam Fox, and William Knoll was there as well.
You're hearing Luke Mogelson here, Where We Live. He's the author, longtime journalist of the book, The Storm is Here, An American Crucible. You can read an excerpt on our website, ctpublic.org/wherewelive. As he writes and explores the growth of the far-right extremism movement in our country. You can join us. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. You spent some time with these militias. You also talked, as you've said, to members of some of these groups that we have seen in the news, especially after the January 6th insurrection, like the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys. But in your book, you also spend time with members of what is known as Antifa in Portland. Tell us about why you did that and what you learned.
Well, so in the summer of 2020, again, after George Floyd was killed, and in the context of these national protests and this historic kind of uprising for police accountability and racial justice, Trump and his allies and other pundits and politicians essentially undertook to discredit and dismiss the demands of these racial justice protesters by villainizing them as Antifa. And I wanted to know, what that was. What was Antifa? I had never met anybody who identified as Antifa, but suddenly, you heard it everywhere as this, referred to as this existential threat to our country and national security. And all of these groups that I had been following, these far right groups who had previously been mobilizing against COVID-19 policies, were suddenly also adopting this rhetoric used by the president and talking about Antifa and holding armed rallies against Antifa. So as a journalist, I was just curious to find out, was this a complete invention, a foil, or was there some factual basis to it? And so that's why I went to Portland, because according to the president, that's where the Antifa headquarters was.
Earlier you talked about the role of conspiracy theories and those that are peddling a lot of what is being shared on social media. I wonder if you can talk more about that and how they influenced these groups that you were talking to on the ground.
Yeah, key to this movement and the energy behind this movement, which is real and intense and can be very effectively weaponized by people in power, as we saw on January 6th, is a sense of victimhood and persecution, and a genuine emotional experience of being oppressed and constantly being threatened by pernicious, all-powerful forces. So given the fact that most of these people aren't actually oppressed or persecuted, and have historically, even been been privileged in our society compared to other demographics. Given all of that, they have to invent sources of oppression, and that's where conspiracy theories come in handy to provide these kind of these fictional villains that allow the far right both to identify as victims and to justify their militancy.
There's also a lot of Nazi language that's used by some of these followers, especially when we talk about the early days of the pandemic and how you describe them as the anti-lockdowners who use this kind of language. And I'm wondering if you can, unpack that for us as well.
Sorry, I lost you for 1 second. Who use what kind of language?
A lot of, mention of Nazis and Nazism by some of these members, especially in the early days of the pandemic. And you would use the term the anti-lockdowners that use this language. I'm wondering if you can unpack that for us.
Right. Well, it's kind of complicated because there were reports early on of, swastikas and Nazi iconography at some of these anti-lockdown events. And what I found was that was true, but they weren't employed as tributes to Nazism. It was more that the anti-lockdowners were accusing the Democratic governor and other proponents of COVID-19 health policies of being Nazis. So they saw themselves as victims in the same way that Jewish people were victims of the Third Reich. And obviously that kind of equivalence is its own kind of anti-Semitism. In that, to the extent that it diminishes the horrors of the Holocaust. But I think it's also just very telling and revealing of how profoundly these people believed in their own victimhood, that for them it was not an exaggeration to compare, lockdown policies with concentration camps. There
was a point that you raised in the book that I wanted to highlight. To that point, Luke, when we think about how they feel that they are victims, but at the same time, some of those members telling you, we're here for everybody. But, during the George W. Bush administration, these militias were fairly quiet during a time when the administration infringed on personal liberties. Can you tell us more there?
Well, exactly. And that's simply because I think the targets of that historic government overreach, surveillance, et cetera, were Muslims and immigrants. And it was, it's also kind of revealing that after being almost entirely dormant for the entire Bush era, where you had incredible overreach by the FBI, NSA, and other federal agencies, all these groups came roaring out of hibernation as soon as Barack Obama was elected. And although it was under the pretext of fearing that their guns would be taken away, it's important to remember that a vast majority of them believed that he wasn't an American citizen, and B, that he was a Muslim.
My guest today is Luke Mogelson, author of The Storm is Here, an American Crucible. He's a longtime correspondent for The New Yorker and has covered the wars in Iraq and Syria, also the social unrest in the U.S. Again, his new book tracks the growth of far-right extremism in the U.S. We'll be talking with him more after a short break. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. My guest is journalist Luke Mogelson. In his new book, he explores the rise of extremism in the U.S. The book is called The Storm is Here, an American Crucible. He takes us first to Michigan, where militias and others protested against COVID restrictions, and then traces the factors that led to the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. He was there. Part of his book looks at why conspiracy theories have become so prominent on the far right, and Mogelson talks to militia members and groups like the Oath Keepers and Proud Boys. He writes they are all working towards a common aim of protecting America against the forces they see trying to deprive them. And as he pointed out in the last segment, the irony that this sense of victimhood is coming from the most privileged in our society. Luke is with us here on Zoom. So take us to January 6th, because as you mentioned earlier, you'd met some people that you would later see there at the U.S. Capitol.
Yeah, including some of the anti-lockdown activists that I had met in Michigan and back in May in the spring of 2020. I actually saw two of the leaders of that movement in the mob that was assaulting police officers on the steps of the Capitol before they were able to breach the building.
And you were,
and I'll just add, and some other folks that I recognized were from Washington and Portland. Mm-hmm. Some of the members of a group called Patriot Prayer that I had seen clashing with anti-fascist and Black Lives Matter activists in Portland over the summer.
Mm. What was that like for you to be caught up in that mob and to see that violence firsthand, Luke?
Well, it was surprising. I wasn't expecting it to get to that point, though I was anticipating violence because there had been two previous rallies in DC on November 14th and on December 12th that had been largely overlooked, both by law enforcement and by the press. But at both of those events, which I had covered as well, there were all the same groups: the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, the different 3%er militias, the America Firsters, and they were attacking Black pedestrians and cyclists. They were vandalizing historic Black churches. They were attacking gay-owned businesses. And the rage had been, just mounting and mounting. And I had witnessed that, firsthand. So I knew that on January 6th, something was going to happen. I didn't know that it would be a mob assault on the U.S. Capitol until, Trump's speech when he directed everybody up the National Mall to the Capitol. Mm.
So you were tear gassed at the Capitol. How did you keep going?
Tear gas, only lasts for a little bit, and then you're fine. But I was also pepper sprayed, and that's a bit worse. But that too, after 10 or 15 minutes, you can see again, and it's fine. Mm. So yeah. Just it wasn't the first time, and that I'd been pepper sprayed and tear gas, so I wasn't too worried about it.
Mm. I'd mentioned, reading the press reports, watching the video firsthand, listening to interviews. We all have an idea of what happened that day. But what really struck you with what you were seeing in front of you, including how the police responded? You had mentioned, there had been more police presence in other events, and mm-hmm. certainly everyone still wonders how this could have happened, that the Capitol Police were overcome.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I had covered the protests and the riots in Minneapolis over the summer, and had witnessed just unbelievable police brutality against peaceful protesters. And, I'm not saying that to gloss over or just, the fact that there were serious riots in Minneapolis, but a lot of the police violence that happened there, and this is something people don't realize, I think, actually took place after the riots were already over, when people were peacefully assembling, and it was really just vengeance against other protesters for what had taken place in the initial 3 days after George Floyd's death. And it was brutal. You had almost 90, more than 90 protesters hospitalized, some of them in their late 70s, some of them as young as 12 years old. And so that, compared with what took place at the Capitol in terms of law enforcement readiness and deployment of force, was really, really striking. And then add on top of that the fact that there were these two previous rallies, which I had mentioned in DC, where the same agencies, the Capitol Police, the Metropolitan Police, and the Park Police, had seen themselves what these groups were capable of. Their unpreparedness on January 6th is something I still don't understand, and I haven't heard any good excuses for it.
Earlier I had mentioned, the fact that, there was a former president and Donald Trump that was speaking directly to those extremist groups. Can you talk more about that and the ways that Donald Trump communicated, and how you saw these members, when you were talking with them, respond?
Yeah, he has an uncanny ability to electrify these audiences. And I'm not, to be honest, entirely sure what it is, because I've attended his speeches and rallies, and I find them to be pretty disjointed and incoherent and not especially moving or inspiring. I don't think he's a very talented orator. And yet, when you're in the crowd at these things, people they just go absolutely wild in a way that you never see on the left or the right at any other political events. So, there was one moment in particular, which is a pretty good example of this, on January 6th, when he was giving his speech from the Ellipse. Mm-hmm. I was in the crowd on the National Mall watching him, and there was this very palpable sense of suspense and expectation, because nobody really knew what he was going to say, if he was really going to go through with it and tell them, to do something. So when there was a moment in his speech when he started to go over some of the allegations about fraud in Georgia and Wisconsin and Arizona, and you could kind of feel people getting a little bored with it, because we'd just come out of 2 months of this, and they were all familiar with the theories. And I think, he has such a good sense for what his followers are feeling and thinking, and that he seemed to be aware of that, their restlessness, and he kind of cut himself short and then just dismissed all of these allegations, which he was supposed to go through in detail, I think, as BS, though he said the expletive himself. And just his use of this profanity, instead of, providing actual facts and details, was an incredible moment in the crowd, because people just went nuts. And it was like, he was kind of telling them that the gloves are off, and the rules no longer apply. Mm-hmm.
And even in your book, again, Luke Mogelson, my guest, author of The Storm, is here. You talk about the way he would use symbols even to communicate, whether it was that speech, I believe, on the 4th of July in Mount Rushmore, to standing in D.C. in front of that church after a peaceful protest was broken up, holding a Bible.
Yeah, that was interesting, because, his walk through Lafayette Square to St. John's Church, which you just referred to, where he raised the Bible, I think that appeared to a lot of people on the left as kind of random and bizarre and almost comical. But to people on the right, and especially the religious right, it was an obvious signal of solidarity to them. And you have to remember, this was happening in the context of the George Floyd protests and this uprising among much of the country for racial justice and these urgent demands that this issue of police violence and systemic racism be addressed. And what he was doing there was, I think, signaling to white Christians that in fact they're the true victims, and that it's not true that they have been historically privileged. And in fact, I saw that gesture repeated and copied by several of his followers subsequently, both in Michigan and then later in the Pacific Northwest, in Pennsylvania, and even on January 6th, I saw among the mob that was storming the Capitol initially on the steps, a man holding up a Bible, just as Trump had done at St. John's. And then a second time that day, inside the Senate chamber, I followed a group of rioters into the Senate chamber. And at one point, one of them, went behind the vice president's desk on the dais and found a Bible and held it up and had his picture taken by his fellow rioters, exactly as Trump had done in front of St. John's over the summer for photographers and journalists.
When we read your book, and again, readers can get an excerpt at our website, ctpublic.org/wherewelive, you do explore the possibility that our country is on the brink of a civil war, but it would be a war fueled by delusion. Can you describe more by what you mean there?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of, what I was talking about earlier, just the fact that that most of the people who are willing to perpetrate violence on behalf of Trump and his allies, the most kind of extreme of the far right, they really are motivated by conspiracy theories. By fear of the deep state, the New World Order, George Soros, international pedophile rings. So that's something that I have never witnessed before abroad. I've reported on wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and Ukraine, and I've never seen a popular militarized mobilization and uprising among citizens based entirely on invented threats and grievances.
Mm. And when we think about invented threats and grievances, the conspiracy theorists that are embraced by some of these groups, look no further than Alex Jones, Luke.
Absolutely. Yeah, which you all are unfortunately more familiar with than most of the country.
Now, I wanted to play a clip because we know, Luke, just 2 weeks ago, President Biden spoke out against these extremist groups, but he also made a point to state that these groups do not represent all Republicans. Let's hear that clip.
Donald Trump and the MAGA Republicans represent an extremism that threatens the very foundations of our republic. Now, I want to be very clear up front. Not every Republican, not even the majority of Republicans are MAGA Republicans. Not every Republican embraces their extreme ideology. I know, because I've been able to work with these mainstream Republicans. But there's no question that the Republican Party today is dominated, driven, and intimidated by Donald Trump and the MAGA Republicans. And that is a threat to this country.
Luke, what did you make of that speech and what President Biden was communicating there?
Yeah, I think it's a fair assessment of the situation, especially the last part in which, the president points out that however prevalent they are numerically, these extremists and conspiracy theorists, they exercise an outsized influence on the right and on conservatives. And I saw that firsthand with Alex Jones at the Million MAGA March on November 14th, where you had tens of thousands of Trump supporters from all over the country, all walks of life, the vast majority by no means extreme or openly adhering to, racist, anti-Semitic ideologies or belonging to any of those groups. And the event was supposed to be an organized march from Freedom Plaza to the Supreme Court up Pennsylvania Avenue. And everybody had packed into Freedom Plaza early in the day to hear a roster of speakers. And Alex Jones was there, but he was not one of those speakers. However, as usual, he had a powerful bullhorn and he stood up on a planter box and he began, ranting and raving as he does about the New World Order, about, Biden being a secret communist agent, et cetera. And just his volume and his, the kind of energy that he projected attracted a larger and larger crowd until there were more people listening to Alex Jones than the scheduled speakers. And finally, at one point, while he was competing basically with the people speaking through the PA system, he announced through his bullhorn that the march was beginning now, even though it wasn't supposed to begin for another hour or so. Mm. He got down and he started walking up Pennsylvania Avenue towards the Supreme Court, and everybody followed him. And it was Alex Jones, accompanied by a security contingent of Proud Boys, including Enrique Tarrio, the national chairman of the Proud Boys, who led the Million MAGA March from Freedom Plaza to the Supreme Court. At the Supreme Court, he commandeered the podium and mic that had been set up there for the scheduled speakers, again started talking about the New World Order to a crowd that now extended into the U.S. Capitol grounds. He was then followed by half a dozen members of Congress, Republican members of Congress, led by Louis Gohmert from Texas, who essentially echoed and endorsed the kind of paranoid rhetoric that Alex Jones had been espousing. So, there you had, in a very compressed physical space and period of time, Alex Jones and the Proud Boys taking over a gathering of right-wing and Republican Americans.
This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public. My guest today, Luke Mogelson, author of the new book, The Storm is Here, An American Crucible. Now, we're talking with him in the same week that 4 men were convicted on felony counts of assaulting or impeding police officers on January 6th. The Washington Post reports one of the men was Patrick McAfee, the third of Ridgefield, Connecticut. He used a riot shield to pin a D.C. police officer to the Capitol's tunnel door. And of the 4 men convicted on Tuesday, the judge found that only McAfee was trying to stop the counting of votes, based on comments he made to friends and to police. After the break, we're going to talk to the Anti-Defamation League, Center on Extremism, about its report on data showing the names of Americans listed on membership rolls to the far-right extremist group, the Oath Keepers, including law enforcement and members of the military. You can join us. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. We've been talking about Luke Mogelson's new book, The Storm is Here, as he reports and explored the rise of the far-right extremist movement in our country. Now, Hearst, Connecticut reported recently on analysis from the Anti-Defamation League of leaked data that show membership to the far-right extremist group, the Oath Keepers. Data show 476 state residents were among 38,000 people nationwide who were part of this Oath Keepers membership database. That list includes elected officials and military members. For more, joining us on Zoom is Alex Friedfeld, investigative researcher with the Anti-Defamation League Center on Extremism. Alex, welcome to the show.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
So how did this data come to light? And tell us how the ADL has responded here.
Yeah, so about a year ago, a journalistic collective released the names of 38,000 individuals who at one point in time signed up to pay dues to the Oath Keepers. And this was an incredible opportunity because it is very rare. You know, usually when we identify extremists because of work that we do ourselves, it's very rare to have a list of names handed to you, let alone thousands of names. And so we saw this as an opportunity not only to get a sense of, who it is that's attracted, to an extremist ideology like the Oath Keepers, but also to identify, key people or people holding key positions in society, whether they're in law enforcement, the military, first responders, or even an elected office. And so we dug through every single one of those names with an eye towards identifying people in those key positions. And what we found were hundreds of people across the country who were in these important roles, right? And that's really of concern because the fact is these are people who have outsized influence within their own communities and they wield power. And the idea that there's any element of extremism within these ranks is, frankly, dangerous and unacceptable.
So what happens now? I understand the Anti-Defamation League, you contacted these law enforcement agencies, but you're making a point not to release all of these names. Tell us about why.
Yeah, so, we really saw this report more as a data report rather than an unmasking report, because the fact is that, we need as good data as possible if we are going to combat the rise of extremism in this country. That said, we have been sharing the names, with, agencies and individuals who have the ability to investigate these individuals further and ask important questions, right, about, these individuals' connections to the Oath Keepers, whether they are still active members, and the extent to which they support this anti-government ideology.
Are there any Connecticut individuals running for office that are in association with the Oath Keepers, Alex?
At this time, we did not identify any people within Connecticut that are running for office or are currently serving in office. And obviously that is great. But this is a problem that we've seen across the country, right? We've identified 81 people who are either holding office right now or are currently running. And that's really of concern because, these are people that, wield power that can really influence their constituents' lives. And the fact that they associate with an extremist ideology or have associated with an extremist ideology in the past raises serious questions about their ability to kind of protect and ensure that everyone within their communities are, taken care of.
Has the Anti-Defamation League heard back from these particular law enforcement agencies? I'm just wondering what the response has been.
Yeah, so we have heard back from a few. I would say a lot of law enforcement agencies mostly kind of thanked us for the work and said they were going to look into and investigate. And a few did go a step further, which was really great. They reached out, asked follow-up questions about the nature of the database, who exactly the Oath Keepers are, and kind of picked our brains, as they attempted to investigate the members within the ranks who showed up in this database.
Mm-hmm. Luke Mogelson is still with us, author of The Storm is Here. Luke, respond to what Alex shared and again, this report on, all of these Americans that are on these membership roles for the Oath Keepers. Does it speak to how well these groups are mobilizing?
Yeah, it's certainly troubling to have, objective evidence and confirmation of that. I would just add that, in addition to an organization with a hierarchy and due-paying members, the Oath Keepers has also become an ethos that is shared by many, many more Americans than show up on those rosters, and by many more law enforcement officers and veterans of the military who believe that, that they have a duty to protect the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, with a stress on domestic. But the way that translates in practical terms for them is a duty to protect the country from liberals and Democrats who are viewed as, part of the deep state or the New World Order.
We just have a couple of minutes, Luke. So when we think about this movement that you've reported on, we've got the midterms ahead. There's the 2024 presidential election. What should we be watching for?
Well, I think that January 6th was incredibly galvanizing for the extreme right, even though they didn't achieve their principal objective, which was to keep Trump in power. I was there, and among all of the participants in the attempted insurrection that I observed, they were they felt a sense of victory just because they had demonstrated what they were capable of, not only to their enemies, but also to each other, to themselves, and to others, like-minded Americans, watching on TV. And I think that if anything, they are eager and chomping at the bit to try something similar. And I'll just add very quickly that I also overheard many people on January 6th saying to each other that next time they were going to bring guns. If they came with guns, they would have solved all their problems.
We'll have to leave it there. Luke Mogelson, author of The Storm, is here. Thank you so much for your time on the show.
Thank you.
I also want to thank Alex Friedfeld, investigative researcher with the Anti-Defamation League Center on Extremism. Alex, thanks for your time as well.
Thanks for having me.
I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today's show produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical director is Kat Pastor. We'll be back tomorrow.